I spent over 100 days turning an empty lake into a massive medieval sea town in Minecraft Hardcore. A city built entirely above the water, filled with towering watchtowers, crowded marketplaces, taverns, trading halls, ships, and winding canals. But building something this big meant gathering thousands of resources, surviving constant attacks, and risking a world where one mistake could erase everything. And by the end of this project, the empty lake would be completely unrecognizable. After my first 2 builds in this hardcore world, I wanted to return to some more familiar territory. I left the desert city behind and made my way back to the first Viking settlement to plan my next step. Right before I arrived, I was greeted by a very lovely welcoming committee, which was kind enough to provide me with some free experience. Very nice of them. All the constant resource farming from my previous projects had left my diamond supply looking pretty terrible, so before I could start this project, I needed to stock up again. Luckily, my good old strip mine was still there. I started mining and it didn't take long until I found my first diamond vein. Honestly, strip mining is still one of the most reliable ways to find diamonds. While mining, I suddenly heard a slime jumping around somewhere nearby. I followed the sound and somehow it actually led me to even more diamonds. It also led me to a surprisingly tough fight with the slime. I had completely forgotten how hard these things can hit. But after some mining, I finally had enough diamonds and other resources to start thinking about the actual project. This time I wanted to build a sea town. Finding the right location was actually harder than I expected. I spent quite a bit of time boarding around until I eventually came across this lake, which was connected to 4 different rivers. And almost immediately I knew this was the place. There was only one problem. This project was going to require wood. And when I say a lot of wood, I mean a lot of wood. So I set up a small survival base nearby, which would function as my headquarters. The design concept for this town was pretty simple. I wanted spruce logs to create the framing of the houses, and more importantly, the massive pile foundations underneath the city, which meant this forest had to disappear. Luckily, my axe was already fully enchanted, which made the entire process much easier. As you can imagine, cutting down thousands of blocks of spruce wasn't exactly the most exciting part of the project. So I loaded up a nice audiobook and started pressing my left mouse button. When farming spruce, I usually prefer growing the massive 4 sapling trees. They give you a ridiculous amount of wood compared to normal spruce trees, and because I had already cut down half the forest, I had more than enough saplings. The second type of wood I needed was dark oak, which would become the main filling material for the buildings. Luckily, directly behind the spruce forest was a dark oak forest. Dark oak was actually pretty pleasant to farm because of the large 2x2 trees. I could show you another 10 minutes of me chopping down trees, but I think we'll skip that. After a few in-game days, the giant spruce trees that I had planted earlier were fully grown, so naturally I started cutting those down as well. Overall, the farming wasn't actually that bad, apart from some mobs who tried to stop the entire project. With roughly a chest full of both types of wood, I finally started building. And the first structure would become one of the most important buildings in the entire town, the watchtower. From a role-playing perspective, the tower would serve 2 purposes. First, it would act as an alarm system for the town, and second, it would work as a navigation point for adventurers, traders and other travelers, letting them know that civilization was nearby. I started with a 7x7 spruce frame rising directly out of the water. The entire city would eventually sit around 2 blocks above the water. This would protect the future citizens from the water while also allowing boats to travel underneath parts of the town. From there, I built a large staircase leading all the way to the top of the tower. It was also important to me that the watchtower felt like a completely wooden structure. Once I reached the height I wanted, I created a small platform and added another 2 floors where guards could theoretically keep watch over the surrounding area. Finally, I finished the tower with a simple but very steep wooden roof. And right at the top I added a blue and white flag representing the town's banner. Now that the first building was standing, I finally had a central point around which I could build the rest of the town. I also had the brilliant idea of using copper lanterns as the main lighting source, which would eventually become a problem, but we'll get to that later. Before I could build houses, shops or anything else, I needed to create the foundations. I wanted the town to have this canal-like atmosphere, similar to places like Venice, where large parts of the city are built directly above the water. At the center of the town, I wanted to keep a small lake which would eventually become the main trading harbor. Foreign traders, sailors could arrive there and display their goods. The foundation followed the same basic design as the watchtower. Spruce logs created the structural framing, while dark oak slabs formed the actual floor of the town. Most Minecraft builds simply used the naturally generated terrain as their foundation. I was not that fortunate. Basically, I had to build my own terrain, and this took a ridiculous amount of time. But the foundation was probably one of the most important parts of the entire project. If I failed to make it look believable, every building I placed on top of it would feel completely out of place. So I started by surrounding the central lake with the framework. From there, I created several channels connecting the surrounding lake and rivers directly to the center of the town. And then came the exciting part, filling everything with dark oak slabs. Thousands and thousands of dark oak slabs. It definitely wasn't the most entertaining work, but as I progressed, I could slowly see the town taking shape. And after getting my first proper look from above, I became even more confident that this idea was actually going to work. So I continued placing spruce foundations and filling them with slabs. There's something strangely satisfying about creating a hospitable environment in a place that was originally nothing more than water. So basically, reshape the world around you. Which I suppose is one of the main reasons we play Minecraft in the first place. Unfortunately, the gigantic unlit platforms also became a wonderful spawning area for mobs. So every now and then, construction had to stop for some unwanted pest control. Once the foundations were finally taking shape, I started collecting the other resources I would need. Back at my main base, I still had a huge supply of copper blocks and copper ore, and I wanted copper to become the main roofing material for the entire town. There was only one issue. Fresh copper is extremely bright orange, and that didn't really fit the atmosphere I wanted for this cold, wet town in the middle of the water. I needed oxidized copper. A lot of it. Luckily, the gigantic foundations I just had built were perfect for oxidizing copper. Copper in Minecraft works somewhat similar to copper in real life. If copper blocks are placed too close together, they oxidize much more slowly. But by leaving around 4 blocks of space between them, you can speed up the process significantly. So I covered the foundations with copper and simply let time do the work. I also started placing copper lanterns around the town. Again. Remember those. With everything prepared, I finally started building the first proper houses. On the first, relatively small island, I wanted 3 buildings, 2 small residential houses and 1 larger trading building. The building blocks remained simple, spruce logs for the frame, dark oak planks for the walls and oxidized copper for the roof. But I didn't want the roof to be entirely out of copper, so I surrounded the copper with dark oak, using wood all along the edges, the ridge and the lowest section of the roof. The larger trading building became the centerpiece, while the 2 smaller residential houses followed the same overall style. And whenever I needed more oxidized copper, I simply collected some from the foundations and replaced it with fresh copper. Basically turning the entire construction site into one gigantic copper aging facility. From above, those first 3 buildings immediately started giving the town its identity. And I was really starting to like where this was going. To connect the different sections of the town, I started building small bridges between the islands. That way, I could finally move around without jumping into the water every 30 seconds. On the southeastern island, I built another small house. This time, I experimented with a more oval shape while still keeping the same architectural style, and honestly, it turned out pretty well. Around this point, my steak supply was completely gone, so I also started growing potatoes nearby. Construction workers need food too. The next building would be much larger. I wanted the island to have a tavern, and considering the view from here, this seemed like the perfect location. I started with a 2-story building where the upper floor extended 1 block beyond the lower floor. It's a very simple technique, but it makes medieval-style buildings look much more interesting. The roof once again used oxidized copper surrounded by dark oak. Beside the tavern, I left enough space for a small outdoor guest area where tired travelers could sit down and enjoy the view. And obviously, the tavern itself needed a bar, some tables, and a few chairs. At this point, the project was already consuming far more resources than I had expected. So once again, I had to make the long journey back to my old base to collect the last remaining copper I had stored there. I packed everything I could carry and headed straight back. But looking at the town now, those first few buildings already created a pretty incredible view. There was still a small empty space in front of the tavern, so naturally I squeezed another residential house into it. I wanted the islands to feel densely built. The more tightly packed everything became, the more believable the town felt when walking around it. And with that final house completed, the second island finally felt finished. Next, I moved on to foundation number 3. This part of the town would mainly focus on commerce. The first thing I needed was an enchanting house. After finishing its basic frame, I switched my attention to the much larger and more important trading center. The trading hall would be a fairly traditional 2-story building with a smaller tower rising through the middle. Once the basic structure was finished, I returned to the enchanting house. For the roof, I basically used every little building trick I knew. And one thing I've learned from building these cities is that even a well-shaped house can look strangely flat without details. Trapdoors, fences, gates, slabs. Those tiny additions make a massive difference. With the enchanting house complete, I switched back to the trading center, which already had most of its frame finished. And surprisingly, completing it was much easier than expected. There was a large open space directly in front of the building, so I decided to turn it into a marketplace. Luckily, I had plenty of wool stored back at the old base, which meant another journey. After eventually returning, I started constructing the market stalls. Each stand was roughly 5 blocks long, 4 blocks wide, and 4 blocks tall. For the roofs, I used white wool mixed with different colors. I didn't want every stall to look identical. Mixing the colors made the marketplace feel much more diverse and alive. And after some final details around the trading center, I could finally call this section finished. But there was still one small area left on the third island. So obviously I needed another building. This time I started with relatively low walls and built an absolutely gigantic roof above them. The idea was to create a place where vegetables, flowers and other plants could be sold. Something between a public garden and a market building. I traveled around the surrounding area, collecting different plants and greenery and started filling the interior. And almost immediately, I knew this was exactly the kind of building the town needed. Now it was time to start working on the 4th and final foundation. This was also the largest platform of the entire town. Directly beside the watchtower, I wanted a small military facility where the guards could store weapons and armor. So I started building the barracks. The design was relatively straightforward, a large L-shaped building with high walls. I continued using the same palette of spruce, dark oak and oxidized copper. While building, I was suddenly attacked by a drowned carrying a trident. Luckily, he couldn't reach me properly while I was standing on the platform, which was actually great news. My security system worked. After dealing with him, I added the final decorative blocks to the barracks and finished the building. And around this point, the problem I mentioned earlier became impossible to ignore. The copper lanterns looked terrible, especially at night. Originally, I thought the green oxidized copper would look good beside the green roofs, but instead everything started blending together. It just didn't work, so there was only one solution. Every single copper lantern had to go. I started replacing them with normal iron lanterns. The ones attached to houses and the upper parts of the foundations were easy. The real problem was underneath the city. I had placed lanterns directly on the support pillars, which meant swimming around beneath the platforms, breaking the old lanterns and replacing them one by one. It was incredibly annoying. And naturally, a few drowned zombies decided to visit me while I was doing it. But after some time, I replaced all of them. And the moment I looked down at the town from above, I knew it had been the right decision. The entire place instantly looked better. The town was getting now surprisingly close to completion. But once again, I needed resources. So I took a short trip into a cave to restock on iron, copper and experience. While exploring, I even found a spider spawner, which might become useful for a future project. Back at home, I built an entire wall of furnaces and started smelting everything. I also rebuilt my enchanting setup and managed to get a pretty solid new axe, which was extremely necessary because my old axe was basically destroyed. And with this new axe, it was time to farm wood again. The gigantic stockpile, which I had collected at the beginning of the project, was already completely gone. After another 2 in-game days of cutting down trees, I finally had enough wood again. I returned to the furnace wall, crafted all of my copper into blocks, and managed to reach level 30 again. Only the last few buildings remained. For this part of the town, I wanted a lot of residential houses. So I started constructing 4 buildings beside each other. But it was very important that they weren't identical. I intentionally changed their heights so the row wouldn't feel too uniform. The inspiration here came partly from the narrow houses you see in Amsterdam. Tall, slightly different buildings packed tightly beside each other. That was the look I wanted. Once again, spruce logs created the frame, dark oak was used around the roofs, and copper became the main roofing material. After several in-game days and an unhealthy amount of jumping around on rooftops, all 4 houses were finally finished, and I was extremely happy with how they looked. There was only one significant empty space left in the entire town. The concept had been inspired by fantasy towns, places like Lake Town from Lord of the Rings, mixed with some real-world inspiration from cities like Venice. But something was still missing: food production. A town like this would need somewhere to keep animals. So, for the final building, I decided to create a large plus-shaped barn. The central section would be used by farmers and workers, while the areas on the left and right would house the animals. Once again, I used spruce logs, dark oak planks, and copper to make sure the building fit naturally into the rest of the town. I collected some greenery from the surrounding plains and then convinced a few pigs and sheep to follow me all the way into the city. For the floor of the barn, I used a mixture of gravel, sand and dirt to give the appearance of a heavily used working area. Then I added plants and smaller details until the place felt finally alive. The central lake still looked a little empty, and considering this was supposed to be the main harbor and trading center, that was a problem. So I started building wooden cranes around the water. From a role-playing perspective, these would be used to unload heavy trading goods from arriving ships. But now that I had cranes, I obviously needed ships. So I built 2 small cargo boats in the harbor. Their design had to remain relatively compact, because the channels leading out of the town were only 5 blocks wide. The first ship was slightly larger. For the second one, I went with a smaller design, inspired by the little merchant ships you often see in fantasy movies. Finally, I added another wooden crane facing the central harbor. And as one of the last details, I placed chimneys throughout the town. I wanted the smoke to reinforce the idea that this was a cold, wet settlement where people constantly needed fires burning inside their homes. And with that, the town was finally complete. After more than 100 in-game days of building, farming, fighting, traveling back and forth for resources, and calculating way too many distances, I was finally finished. What started as nothing more than an empty lake had become an entire town. It had residential districts, markets, a tavern, a trading center, military barracks, a harbor, farms, ships, and its own network of canals. And I'm really proud of how it turned out. Thank you all so much for watching the entire video. I really appreciate all of you who made it this far. And hopefully, I'll see you again in the next one. Until next time.